How did the pharaohs rule ancient Egypt? And why did the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, who revered as gods, for whom massive pyramids were built, have far fewer resources to govern the country than the modest pharaohs of the New Kingdom? How did Semitic people introduce the concept of law to Egypt? How could ordinary people challenge the decisions of local authorities? And how were officials punished for abuse of power? Hi everyone, my name is Mikhail Rodin. This is The Frontiers of Historical Research. Alex Loktionov, an Egyptologist from Cambridge, will tell us about how ancient Egypt was governed. Okay, we will talk about the mechanisms of ruling in ancient Egypt. And at first, could you set the chronological frame, what periods we are talking about, and what was Egypt like in that times, borders, international connections, and what power pharaohs were at the disposal?
Yeah, great. So conventionally, when we talk about Egyptology as a discipline, we are usually looking at the period from around about 3000 BC to around about the Roman conquest, really. So that would be 30 BC with the death of Queen Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. So during that time, we divide up the Egyptian history into three main kingdoms. So that's the Old Kingdom, which broadly speaking occupies most of the 3rd millennium BC. That's when you build pyramids, that's when the Egyptian state first comes into being. Then you have a short period called the First Intermediate Period, which is a sort of interregnum when there is no one pharaoh ruling the country. There's a lot of decentralization of power in the land. And then from around about 2000 BC, we're into the Middle Kingdom. And that is a shorter period. It lasts for about 400 years and is associated with the high point of ancient Egyptian literature. So they're still building pyramids, but pyramids are smaller. There is more focus on the literary tradition, if you like. And when you teach Egyptian to students, typically you will begin by teaching them texts from that period. Then you get a collapse, and you're in the Second Intermediate Period, which again sees decentralized power, and in particular the north of the country is controlled by the Hyksos, who are a Semitic people who are not originally Egyptian, and they bring in a lot of things into the country which were previously absent. And that again lasts for about 100 years, and then in the mid 2nd millennium BC, we start the New Kingdom, so from about 1500 BC or just before. And that lasts for half a millennium, until the 11th century BC. And that New Kingdom is when you have the most famous pharaohs. That's when you've got the Tutankhamuns and the Ramseses and the Thutmoseses and all these people ruling the country. The New Kingdom, no more pyramids. Instead, this is when we've got the Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, when we also have large-scale imperial expansion. So before the New Kingdom, Egypt, okay, is a large country, and in the Middle Kingdom there is some expansion in the south, in what is known as Nubia, modern-day Sudan, but it doesn't really harbor large-scale imperial ambitions. In the New Kingdom, that really changes, and there is extensive military action all the way from the Fifth Cataract of the Nile, which is very deep into Sudan now, so all of Nubia becomes Egyptian, and also most of the Levant. So under the reign of Thutmose III, for example, you've got Egyptians reaching the river Euphrates, so going really very far north. It's probably the largest empire that the world had seen up to that point. And then in the 11th century BC, we get another decentralization of power. That, in general, is a very difficult time for the large Mediterranean civilizations. This is often called the Bronze Age collapse. So other countries are falling apart as well. They've got the Hittite Empire really struggling. The Assyrians and Babylonians seem to be in decline. Ugarit is sacked and conquered by the Sea Peoples. All sorts is going on. And Egypt doesn't necessarily collapse in the same kind of way, but it has to pull back. And we're then in the Third Intermediate Period, which is about 400 to 500 years of decentralized rule, where there are different kinglets in different parts of Egypt. Periodically, there are foreign powers ruling the land as well. So you've got Nubians, you've got Assyrians, you've got civil war at times as well. Difficult. And then that decisively ends really in the middle of the first millennium BC, when the whole country is conquered by Persia. That inaugurates the Persian period up until the 4th century BC, when all of that's conquered again by the Greeks. You get Alexander the Great, and he and his successors, the Ptolemies, are more or less in charge until the Roman conquest. And conventionally, it's that point when Rome takes over Egypt that that would be the point when an Egyptologist would really hand over to a classicist in the study of that particular culture. So that's by way of chronology. In terms of just structures of power, and I know you've probably got more specific questions on that front coming up, but just to say very briefly, the conventional view is that Egypt is very much a theocracy where the king is not just God's vicegerent or representing a god, but actually goes beyond that. And the king actually is a god. So on a practical level, that means they run every cult, or at least they are supposed to be in charge of every cult. They're in charge of the army. They are the head of state. Their word is law. What I've been trying to show in a lot of my research is that things are a lot more nuanced than that. And hypothetically, they've got this absolute power. But that's not really how it is. There is a framework for the rule of law in the country. There are all kinds of high officials reporting to the vizier or to local governors. And that's really what I'm doing and trying to shed some more light on.
Am I right that we can't talk about Egypt like the monolith state in different times? Because in different times it is not the same. We have different relationships between the core imperial center and the regions of Egypt.
That's a great question. So I think in practice, Egypt changes enormously across the different periods when that you can study as an Egyptologist. But that does not necessarily mean that the Egyptians wanted it to look that way. The Egyptian pharaohs were very keen on the idea of a shared history, of a continued historical tradition. So even pharaohs as late as, say, Cleopatra, would have wanted to have the same royal titles, the same royal dignity as the pharaohs of the days of the pyramid building. So there's this very conscious desire to portray this all as one state, as kind of one enduring thing, ancient Egypt, enduring Egypt. We've got to remember even that, for example, to a Greek or a Roman observer, the pyramids, let's say, were already deeply ancient. The pyramids were more ancient to Julius Caesar than Julius Caesar actually is to us in terms of the chronological gap between them. So they want it to all come across as one state. In reality, of course, that's not really the case because of these intermediate periods. So when you've got a kingdom, say the Old Kingdom, that is a fairly stable mode of government. There's a strong administrative core. Power is very strongly centralized around Memphis and around the pharaoh. And while that system lasts, it lasts. However, when you get into the first intermediate period and you get fragmentation between different centers of power within Egypt, that is the opportunity for real political and legal innovation to come into being. In particular, that's a time when far fewer resources are being directed away from the provinces and into the center, because the central taxation mechanism has collapsed. So you get more resources staying locally, you get more scribes, more legal officials being trained up locally, and these people give rise to a set of provincial administrations that hadn't really been previously in place. So when The Middle Kingdom re-emerges when the country reunites. It reunites in a way which might kind of look the same to an external observer. There's a pharaoh in charge of the whole thing again. But you've now got a much better developed set of local officials in the provinces. You've got a very different way of administering the law locally. It's a lot less top down. And again, then you get the Middle Kingdom. That stays in place for a few hundred years while that lasts. Then in the Delta, in the north of Egypt, you've got pharaonic power effectively being replaced by foreigners, by the Hyksos, Semitic people from the Levantine area. These people come in and they bring in a whole load of new ideas in that next period of fragmentation, the Second Intermediate. So they bring in things like legal codification. They also bring in transport innovation. So they bring horses, they bring chariots, they bring all these things that the Egyptians hadn't had. Eventually they get driven out. Country reunites. It's the new kingdom now. So again, a lot of effort goes in to making it look like it's the same thing, like the Middle Kingdom, like the Old Kingdom, back to one pharaoh. But you've now got chariots. You now got wheeled transport. You now got codified law. There are all these things which below the surface are actually quite different. And that's really the story of Egypt through the centuries. If you look at it as a kind of untrained observer, or as an ancient Greek or a Roman, as Herodotus or whoever, you might think of it, this is all one thing, but it's not. Across the first millennium BC as well, coming out of the New Kingdom, this carries on, because you got more invasions. You've got Assyrians, you got Nubians, you got Greeks, you got Persians, you got Romans. They're all coming in, and they're all leaving a mark on that cultural fabric. It's always a pharaoh on top, sometimes native, sometimes a foreigner, who's kind of trying to keep the show on the road, trying to make it look traditional. But beneath, it's certainly by the later periods, it's a fascinating tale of how immigrants are really starting to shape that country. And that's sort of 3,000 years of really dynamic change under a surface of constancy.
Everyone has heard of the Code of Hammurabi and other Mesopotamian sources on this subject. What sources inform us about the judicial and administrative system in Egypt?
Great. So here, I think it's important to bear in mind that what we're dealing with are probably not strictly codified systems. These are common law systems. And that actually, I think, is true of Hammurabi as well. And I'm just going to say a few words quickly about Hammurabi, because it's better to start somewhere where we know and then move into slightly more unfamiliar territory. So with Hammurabi, it's often thought that, it's as if if a man knocks out the tooth of another man, his tooth shall be knocked out. This kind of stuff. This is codification. That is not probably the case. What this is a set of verdicts, of specific verdicts, which Hammurabi actually adjudicated and handed down when he was king. So acting as a judge in his capacity as king, he writes down the verdicts, and then these verdicts can serve as precedent for courts in later times. How do we know that? Well, because we never have any reference in Mesopotamian legal documents to Code of Hammurabi or to any of these ancient codes. It never says, such and such was found guilty, and in accordance with the Code of Hammurabi, this was done to them. That's just not done. It's not like a modern Roman law style system. Instead, what tends to happen is the case is heard, and then the judge or a collection of judges look at precedent. So they look at how earlier famous judges, including Hammurabi or others like him, how did people in the past deal with these sorts of things? And they come up with a verdict. Ancient Egypt, for most of its history, is very, very similar. So courts will be writing down what decisions were made, and then later decisions are made to align with precedent. At the same time, though, certainly by the New Kingdom, the situation is starting to change because the Hyksos have come in and they have this stronger tradition of codification. And that is, yes, that is a tradition that's grown out, I would think, of Hammurabi, but it's going beyond that. We're still not quite sure what exactly the Hyksos legal tradition is. We don't have the sources, really. It's a very short period in history. But we are starting to really see the development of this concept of hep. So there's a specific word, hep, which means law that can be alluded to. And in the New Kingdom, we have texts, for example, which say, "Segem minetetem hep," may something be heard in accordance with that which is in the law. So no longer are we making a verdict informed by previous precedent, but we are actually hearing a case in accordance with that which is in the law. And we've got a text called the Instructions of the Vizier, sometimes also the Duties of the Vizier, from the Tomb of Rechmira, New Kingdom text, which talks in a great deal of depth about how the Vizier, and the Vizier is like a head of government, he is the top official, top judicial official under the pharaoh, how that Vizier should behave when hearing cases, when judging cases. And there are very specific examples, for example, as to what you do if you hear a case regarding fields. If you hear a case regarding agriculture in such and such a district of Egypt, this is how much time you allot to hear the case. This is how you carry it out. If it's a different part of Egypt, you have to go at a quicker rate. So procedurally, things get a lot more prescriptive. You're also dealing with a system that probably has ever-growing numbers of scribes. So the bureaucracy keeps growing. And that's to do, again, with these intermediate periods, that whenever you have a breakdown in central authority, the provincial areas get more money, they're being taxed less, and as a result, they're able to set up clearer scribal traditions. They're able to train up more bureaucrats who can then perpetuate that tradition. So by the New Kingdom, we are seeing far more legal documents being produced than was the case in, say, in the Old Kingdom. And we're seeing far more specialists in the legal tradition, far more, if you like, lawyers. And if we look at the practical effects of this, what we will see is typically Old Kingdom legal officials are very senior figures in the administrative corps near the pharaoh, who are not specialized judges. They are rather carrying out judgment alongside a whole host of other activities. These might be administrative, these might be military, they might have temple priesthoods, they might be working in the treasury, they might even be regional governors, all kinds of things. By the Middle Kingdom, though, we're starting to see people who have far fewer titles, who might essentially be just doing law, just engaged in legal cases on a local basis. That's their work. And in the New Kingdom, that trend continues. As well as that, I think because you've got this greater level of prescriptiveness to do with more bureaucracy, more writing, we get texts regarding the vizier, such as the instructions of the vizier, the duties of the vizier, which tell us exactly what these high officials were having to do as well. So you get more prescription for both high officials and more local level officials, set against just a wider backdrop of there being far more legal documents. And that means it's a lot easier to work with Middle Kingdom or New Kingdom material than it is with the Old Kingdom. Even easier, by the way, to work in the first millennium BC when you've got Greek sources, because by that period, there's a lot that's being written not only in Egyptian but also in Greek. And so again, you've got this increase in what you can study.
Okay, now we can see differences between judicial systems in different times. But if we return to the government, how was the system organized in ancient Egypt in different periods?
So the easiest way to look at this, I think, is probably through how Pharaoh is actually understood theologically. Is Pharaoh seen to be a complete god, or is Pharaoh seen to be as something a little bit less divine, a little bit more human? And the reason this is a good way to study that material is because it allows us to then use funerary evidence, which in Egypt is well known, that's particularly strong, to better understand the political process. In the Old Kingdom, you've got this very distinct form of pharaonic afterlife, obviously, the pyramids, the Great Pyramids being the best example. This is something which, if you're not a pharaoh, you're simply not going to get. So at this time, it would seem that pharaoh is classed as an altogether different class of being, not really even a human, as sort of above that. And power is centralized very strongly. The state is relatively small, so there aren't really any imperial pretensions to conquer Nubia or to conquer the Levant or whatever. We're dealing very much with the Nile Delta and Valley, and the administrative core, the bureaucracy, is based around the pharaoh, and the high officials who are doing, whether that is judging or collecting taxes or raising armies or whatever it may be, they are all in and around Memphis. They're around that core. When the Old Kingdom collapses at the end of the third millennium BC, there seems to be both a political change in the country and an ideological alteration as well. And this is, of course, understandable because the unthinkable had happened. Centralized authority had collapsed. Pharaonic power had shown that it was not as infallible, not as unchangeable, not as constant as had previously been assumed. It had fallen apart. So when it is recreated in the Middle Kingdom, it is recreated against a backdrop of much greater local autonomy. Local officials, local scribes have a lot more power. Pharaoh, at least if you look at the archaeology, you could think is weaker. They're not building enormous pyramids, they're building much smaller pyramids. I mean, they're still in charge, obviously, but archaeologically they don't look as impressive. However, underneath this might actually lie a mechanism for a deeper level of power. It's not as ostentatious, but it's deeper. Because now there are these local officials, there are these local scribes who are deeply embedded in local communities and can do the pharaoh's work for the pharaoh. Previously, okay, in the Old Kingdom, you got pharaohs sitting in Memphis. He's a god. He's notionally all powerful. But can he really know what's going on somewhere in the south of the country? He doesn't have a proper taxation apparatus. He doesn't have the scribes. He doesn't have the officials there because they've not really been trained. So these people are probably living a kind of completely independent sort of life with only very nominal control by the pharaoh. In the Middle Kingdom, that pharaoh might look more sort of closer to the people, but it's because he's closer to the people that he's got more power. He's now got the resources, the admin structure to get things out of them. And I think in the New Kingdom, after the second set of collapses and the second intermediate, this probably strengthens further because you retain these local provincial scribes, but now you've also got a much firmer mechanism of legal control. So you're starting to get elements of codification. You've got HEP as a concept. You've got ever-growing numbers of scribes. So yeah, it's very interesting how you've got a decline in maybe how almighty the pharaoh is perceived to be, but a strengthening in the bureaucratic power of the state and of the pharaoh as a kind of political institution. This having been said, the strengthening of the law does also bring problems for pharaoh. Law means he is in charge and gives him more control, but it also starts to place limits on what that pharaoh can do. So we have a famous text, for example, Papyrus Westcar, which explicitly states that a pharaoh cannot execute a person without due process. We have a whole host of events happening after the reign of King Akhenaten, who had essentially tried to comprehensively reform the Egyptian religion, which say, no, a pharaoh can't do that. You cannot just use your executive power to reform the religion. Then, moving into the first millennium BC, you have even more striking examples of that. You have oracular literature, things like the Oracle of the Potter and the Oracle of the Lamb in the very, very late period of Egyptian history, which explicitly state that it was because pharaohs had not been doing their job properly that difficult times had come to Egypt, and pharaoh starts being a subject of criticism. So that's another feature. As levels of literacy, levels of scribalism, levels of legal awareness go up, pharaoh has more opportunities for state control, but there are also slightly greater opportunities to hold the pharaoh to account.
It's amazing. If I'm not mistaken, you have wrote that in the Middle Kingdom we can see the evidence for the distinction between the notion of state and government. And how did this principle manifest itself?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think if we talk about quite a modern distinction here, the head of state and the head of government, which we conventionally associate with modern political systems. Ancient Egypt, I would argue, is the oldest political system where you've got that. You've got a head of state, that's the pharaoh, and you've got the head of government, which is the vizier, the top government official of the pharaoh. Now, as head of state, pharaoh will be the high priest of every cult, the overseer of the entire religion, the head of the armed forces as well. As such, the pharaoh will probably be expected to lead the army. If the army goes to war, pharaoh will actually lead it out in person. And we know, at least in some cases, pharaohs actually fought in battle and sometimes even died. The vizier, however, is the person who is collecting the taxes, who is running the internal administration of the country, who is ensuring that justice is done. Because of that, the vizier is responsible for really the day-to-day running of the affairs of state, and pharaoh is probably, even during the periods when pharaoh is relatively involved, pharaoh is not the person doing the day-to-day running of Egypt. Hardly anybody, unless they're really in very high office, would have interacted with pharaoh. They would be interacting with the vizier, and we can see that the sort of the more divine a pharaoh is, certainly in the Old Kingdom, the harder I think it would have been for them to conduct these day-to-day affairs, because that's simply not what a god does. If you are a god, you do not talk to ordinary people. You're in a different category to them. A final point as well here, to do with distinction between state and government, is that pharaoh and the state that he ran were seen as eternal, whereas government definitely was not. Pharaoh is, well, theologically, pharaoh is the living form of the god Horus. When one pharaoh dies and a new pharaoh comes in, Horus simply changes bodily vessel, from one body to another body. Horus himself, though, is completely eternal. So, in a sense, pharaoh is Horus, therefore pharaoh is eternal as well. Not got a beginning, not got an end. So you cannot talk really about the head of state changing. The head of state is always Horus in one form or another. Governments, though, change. Viziers obviously change. Policy under a particular vizier can change as well. And I would think that if a pharaoh wanted to change course, to change political course, the way you do that is you change your vizier. These offices are not always hereditary. You can appoint, well, maybe not whoever you like, but there's a pool of appointable people, and that's your mechanism for adapting policy without making it look like the god has become somehow impermanent or flaky.
You have mentioned the word "hep." Could you provide a little bit a clear picture of how it's related to Semitic
Law.
influence?
So this is something I've worked on a lot. It needs, I think, further study. It's not a term which in and of itself is Semitic. So there's no mention of Hep at all in the Old Kingdom, none, absent. It starts to appear in the Middle Kingdom in the first centuries of the second millennium BC. So this is during that time, which, as I said, was the high watermark of ancient Egyptian literature, and the levels of literacy and scribalism are going up. So this is when you get the first mentions of Hep, and it is fairly isolated. At this point, it probably refers more to not just written codified law as such, but to relatively specific customs, the way things are done. So a Hep may refer to the way in which something is done. And you have titles like, Emira Hepu, overseer of the Hep. These are probably people who are regulators, tasked with making sure that the done way of doing things is followed. In the Middle Kingdom, as I say, this is when that process started, when you first get Hep. But in the New Kingdom, things start to change because there is a big expansion in how that Hep is deployed. And that's important because it is the New Kingdom where Hep is, I think, associated with Semitic influence. The Semitic people, the Hyksos, took control of the Egyptian Delta throughout the Second Intermediate period. So they're in charge between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. These are the people who probably had greater reliance on codification in their legal tradition. And what we see in the New Kingdom is that codification takes off. So you've got things like the Horemheb decree, the Nauri decree of Seti I, various other shorter decree texts as well. So these are steely or sort of large documents where Pharaoh says, if this, that, and the other is done, then consequences will follow. So it's this if-then conditional style law, protasis apodosis, as we would call it in the scholarly literature, action and consequence. And this is literally now set in stone. This is codified. So we are seeing in the New Kingdom documents which are, well, at least they look a lot more like Hammurabi. Now, I suspect that they are used in a different kind of way to how Hammurabi was used. Hammurabi is precedent. It's there to inform future legal decisions. This stuff is actually codified law. It says if tax is collected improperly, Pharaoh has decreed that a particular punishment, very often a beating or a fine, is to be carried out. That's stated very clearly. So you've got this massive expansion of how Heb is codified, how it is presented to the people, and that expansion happens after the period of Semitic control of the Delta. And this I don't think is coincidental, much in the same way as it's not coincidental that you got chariots or horses staying in Egypt after the Semitic people had come in. They come in, they bring them there, these things stay. Same, I think, with the legal tradition.
Okay, you have mentioned it a little bit, but I would like you to talk about it a little bit more. How did the imperial government interact with provincial authorities, and how did imperial laws interact with provincial laws? I think that maybe it's more interesting to talk about the Middle Kingdom because it is more complex.
Yeah. So I mean, you get imperial and provincial interaction in both the Middle Kingdom and in the New Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is interesting because that is when the first efforts to expand the state into an empire actually take place. In the Middle Kingdom, especially in the 12th dynasty, so these are pharaohs like Senusret the First and Senusret the Third, there is all-out conquest of Nubia, or at least of the north of Nubia. Troops are sent in, and this is a policy of colonization. There isn't really any effort to listen to local people. The policy is that we will send in troops. These people are in need of being Egyptianized. They are essentially barbarians, and we will build forts. We will build garrisons. We are going to take over this country wholesale. We know very little about indigenous forms of law in Nubia prior to the imposition of Egyptian government and Egyptian law. The Egyptians come in, they impose themselves. Presumably, the local people, if they wanted justice, would have had to go to these organs of colonial authority. So that's Nubia, and that's the first Egyptian colonization effort there. In the New Kingdom, things are different because colonization of Nubia continues and it expands and it goes further south and it probably becomes even more brutal. But at the same time, Egypt carries out expeditions and attempts at colonization in the north. So this is, as I was saying, when the Egyptian troops reach the river Euphrates, when they end up taking over almost the entirety of the Levant at one time under the reign of Thutmose III. But there, the approach to colonization is very different, and the approach to law and administration is very different. Because here, they are dealing with city states that have armed forces, okay, which are much smaller than Egypt's, but which are comparatively well trained and well armed, which have their own administrative structures, which have literate structures. These places have the cuneiform script, they have taxation systems, they have histories going back thousands of years as independent states. And the Egyptians have a much greater level of respect for these authorities in the Levant. And if the strategy with the Nubians almost always is, we send in the soldiers, we build a fort, we impose ourselves on you, the interactions here are more along the lines of sort of little brothers. We, Egypt, we are the sort of the big brother, we are the senior figure in the relationship, but we don't actually want to fully impose ourselves on you. If you have a legal system, if you have an administrative system that works, okay, we want you to politically be subservient to us, to pay us tribute, to supply troops for our army, whatever, to provide us with your ports for when we go trading. But we don't actually mind if you continue living in your own way and notionally, at least, these Levantine city states retain some level of independence. So, to summarize this in a sentence, you've got full colonization in the south, full imposition of the imperial law, and a much more hands-off approach in the north, where these territories are able to carry on largely as previously, provided that they cooperate on the political questions.
Okay, but you talked about new regions. What about the Nile regions, core Egyptian region? Because I think
Yeah, yeah.
it's very interesting. Different regions, different laws.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is going to be just geographic, right? So, if you are in the Nile Delta, you've got a slightly different needs compared to the Nile Valley. You've got different patterns of hydrology in terms of how the Nile floods. You've also got just different
Different
climatic
traditions.
situations, different traditions too. So you've got all of this happening. I think uh, the kind of law that Pharaoh would have been seeking to carry out across the country would have been standardized, or at least that was the intention. So this is why you have these local scribes, who are all associated with this concept of segem, of hearing. This is why you've got that overarching idea of ma'at. The first time today, I think that we mention it, but it's very important. The idea of right conduct. So that the sort of formal law, I think, would have been relatively standardized. What we know so much less about are the local legal traditions which are unrecorded or which are poorly recorded. So, from the New Kingdom, for instance, we know about Deir al Medina, the workers' village. It's a very famous settlement for the workmen who were working on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Now, in Deir al Medina, there's an oracle, there's a local court which is supposed to reflect the wishes of the local deity. And these kinds of oracles probably existed in different parts of the country, and we know very little about individually how these would have operated. As well as that, you've probably got village type justice, village headmen, community leaders coming together, uh, discussing cases orally, passing down verdicts. These verdicts haven't been preserved. We know, or we can be confident, that such a tradition would have existed, really more through ethnographic parallels, because that's typically how African societies adjudicate if they are non-literate. So most of Egypt, even in the New Kingdom, most people were not literate. So you're probably handing down justice orally. Now, all of this is legal pluralism, and I've written a lot on legal pluralism before, but at the same time, I still really struggle with working out how we can study it. We can study the formal system, and we can then say, okay, there would have been more, because most people didn't have access to it because they couldn't read and write. But beyond saying there would have been more and showing some awareness of oracles, these local gods, we don't know. We don't know what was going on. It would have certainly, I think, been a system of very limited enforcement capability. It would have been difficult to force people to comply with local decisions. So there would have had to be a big element of consensus building. So local courts would have been coming to decisions that were acceptable to everyone in the community, or at least to a critical mass. And that's how you still see things being done in traditional societies in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, even to the present day. Enforcement is weak, so you've got to have consensus-based measures. Whereas for the formal stuff, the recorded stuff, enforcement is relatively strong, and so you can just follow the law to the letter.
Okay, but if we talk not about the legal system, but about a particular system of governance, were there general principles of governance, or did everything depend on the will of a particular official?
Yeah, so in terms of general principles, this is where the idea of mart, of right conduct, comes in. And there's a big genre of Egyptian literature, what we call wisdom literature, which refers to this, which discusses it. So mart is both an idea standing for the smooth running of the universe, and Ma'at is also a specific goddess. Now, Ma'at, the goddess, this among other things is the goddess who um, provides the souls of the dead with the feather of truth. So when you're going into the afterlife, the heart of the dead person is measured against the feather of Ma'at, and that decides whether you're righteous or not. So there's a whole host of religious afterlife elements there. But in terms of Ma'at, the concept, what we're dealing with here is an overarching idea that it's important to be truthful, it's important to respect power. So Mart it's a very hierarchical kind of idea. The way Egypt functions and the smooth functioning of Egypt is guaranteed through different people in society all knowing their place. So if you
It's
are
it's looking
a
like
peasant, be happy with.
it's looking like more moral or the way of thinking, but not like lore and so on.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It's a philosophy. It's not a law. And I think this is why it's important to talk about Mart and HEP. HEP is these are the practical guidelines for what it is that you actually have to do. And you get the philosophical texts, the wisdom literature about Mart, which talks about how do you live your life. And you would think that HEP, in those cases in which it is formulated out of Mart. Now, whether there are major distinctions between different provincial areas is quite difficult to say because we've only got good supplies of texts from a very small number of them. There would, of course, be differences in local gods who was being worshipped. You also would have differences in local populations. So, in the Nile Delta, for instance, you're going to have a demographic that has many more Semitic people, later on Greek people, people of Libyan extraction as well. In the south, you're going to get many more Nubians. So these people will be coming with their own uh, distinct ideas on how Mart should be interpreted and how uh, particular issues have to be administered as well. They're also looking in different directions. Are you, for instance, going to be trading with the Mediterranean world, or are you going to be trading with sub-Saharan Africa? Who are you interacting with?
Okay, let's dive in governance maybe deeper. Did a lower ranking holder of public offices and
Mhm.
ordinary Egyptians have any guarantees against of arbitrariness of higher authorities?
Yeah, so this is one of the things which is talked about a lot in the New Kingdom with regards to the two texts which I mentioned earlier. So the Horemheb decree and the Nauri decree of Seti I. So these are these two key legal texts that I've done quite a bit of work on, which talk specifically about offenses carried out by tax collectors, by temple officials against the local population. And these typically say that if the local population is being taxed unfairly or if resources are being extorted from them, then the guilty officials are to be stripped of their offices, frequently imprisoned. They might be mutilated, they might be beaten, they might be sent to the labor camps, the quarries of Kush. So there's an awareness there at the highest political level that corruption is a major issue in Egypt. They know that. At the same time, was any of this effective? Well, difficult to say. a very famous Egyptian story, the tale of the eloquent peasant, talks about a peasant who is unfairly detained, who is imprisoned by an official who is essentially corrupt, and he has to spend many days and probably months of his life petitioning a higher official, and eventually petitioning the pharaoh himself. In the story, after multiple rounds of petitions, I think it is 7 or 8, the peasant is freed, and justice triumphs. The peasant is freed. The perpetrator is forced to give up his own wealth to the peasant to compensate him. But that's just a story. That's probably a kind of happy ending. I think the most important element of that is that it talks about this need to petition and petition and petition and to just keep going because the wheels of justice are turning so slowly. We've also got documents, uh, prayers in particular from the New Kingdom, which are appealing to the god Amun, the king of the gods, for help in the law court. And these prayers often allude to bribery. So they're explicitly saying, uh, you know, give me help because I do not have the money to bribe the officials. So again, there's a recourse to law to uh, allow local people to restore justice, but whether that recourse is going to lead anywhere is I think another matter. And there's so many more examples of corruption in ancient Egypt that we can talk about.
But central governments tried to fight with that, right? Why did they do that?
Yeah. There's an attempt to deal with corruption. It's an ongoing issue. I mean, by the late New Kingdom, for instance, you've got the tomb robbery papyri, where we can see that things are going really very badly wrong. We've got people robbing the tombs of former kings. Uh, there's even an instance of a royal mummy of a king and his wife being set on fire in order for the thieves to get access to the gold and jewelry which is in the bandages. So all of this is stuff is being stolen on a nearly industrial scale. Then guards are being bribed in order to not arrest the thieves. The guards then get a share of the portion of the loot. So all sorts of things are going wrong. There's a famous case actually which I managed to publish last year, the Tomb Chapel of Mosa, which talks about a law case which went on for about 100 years, concerning a large plot of land where the land register had been falsified because of a bribe, and because of that, the rightful owner of the land could not get hold of it. So we can see that the whole system, certainly in the New Kingdom, for which we have the best textual records, is quite spectacularly corrupt. Of course, the government tries to deal with it because, on one level, this kind of corruption is not good. It's a drain on resources. It makes it harder to collect tax. It generally just makes the state very, very, very inefficient. Um, I would say, though, that it is probably not coincidental that the most complicated cases dealing with corruption in ancient Egypt, and the best preserved cases, are those that come from the very end of the New Kingdom, before the whole thing collapses. So it's clear by about 1100 BC that corruption is rampant. We've got in Deir al Medina, where you've got the local workman's village, we've got depositions of people trying to write to the pharaoh about the need to remove foremen and sort of chief workers because these people are using building materials to build homes for themselves instead of building royal tombs. There's this kind of stuff. It's all falling apart, and eventually it does. and that's, I would say, a key reason why the New Kingdom falls apart. It's self-enrichment on a really big scale.
Okay, next, I think, related case. How did the pharaohs fight against arbitrariness of local authorities in matters of illegal forced labor, and
Yeah,
why?
yeah. So if you are a pharaoh, you obviously want to make sure that labor is carried out, but you want to make sure that labor is carried out for the state. You don't want labor being carried out for the private individual. This is, by no means, I think, unique to Egypt. You can think about, much more modern systems in various countries around the world where, I don't know, a general is responsible for conscripting soldiers and conscripts the soldiers, and the soldiers then, instead of training for military activity, are used to construct a secondary residence for the general, or whatever. This kind of stuff. It happens now. It was happening in ancient Egypt too. Uh, as I mentioned, the Deir al Medina cases where uh, people chief workers are receiving building material to build a royal tomb. Instead of that, they divert the building material and their own subordinates to build, to add an extension to their house, or whatever the case may be. Tax collectors who, instead of collecting the tax for the pharaoh, uh, arbitrarily decide to increase the rate of tax in the local area, either to take a cut off it for themselves, or in some cases to just take the whole thing. So this both makes the pharaoh look bad and undermines trust in the whole system. And perhaps more significantly, it also redistributes wealth in a very toxic kind of way. So what Pharaoh probably kind of wants is there to be a relatively uniform hierarchy of wealth. Pharaoh has the most wealth on the top, and the state has a budget. Then you've got high officials who retain a portion of the wealth. Then you've got the bulk of the population who's got much less wealth. If, however, you redistribute wealth in such a way that it is, that middle official class that collects the money and doesn't pass that money on to the top, you get a bloated officialdom, a very poor, potentially destitute population that's being overtaxed, and also a crown that doesn't have enough money either, because the resources are not going through to it. That money is getting stuck in that middle rank. Um, and the pharaoh, I think saw that. In particular, they saw the prospect of temples becoming overmighty in that regard. If a temple is doing the taxing and doesn't pass that on, then the temple might potentially become a source of power to rival the pharaoh, and it does. Again, in the New Kingdom, when the New Kingdom falls apart, it is the temples in the south, in Thebes, which become that rival power base. You got the high priests there, essentially declaring themselves to be pharaohs because they've got just as much money. And that is what was the worry, and that is what came about.
Am I right that ordinary Egyptians had the full right of appeal on local authorities' decisions, and was in mutual interest of the Egyptians and the pharaohs?
So in theory, yes. Again, if you look at that text of the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, uh, this describes how this peasant loses his property. He is falsely put in jail. He submits an appeal, and he submits appeal after appeal until eventually Pharaoh hears him and he is reprieved. So, in theory, there is scope to do that. We see that in the wisdom literature as well, in these texts about morality, which talk about how important it is for a high official to judge those under him fairly and to hear appeals. And that in so doing, you uphold both Maat and you support the pharaoh. In practice, though, I suspect that for most ordinary people, the prospect of an appeal would have been extremely difficult. This is why you're getting prayers. It's easier to just pray to the gods that your court case will be handled well than it is to have an all-out appellate procedure. Where do you appeal to? If you're in a local court, presumably you're going to appeal to a high official or even to Pharaoh, who might be hundreds of miles away. There are almost no roads. Well, in fact, there are no roads by and large. There's only the Nile. You have to travel along the Nile. Have you got a boat? Probably not, if you're just a low-level citizen. Have you got the capacity to write and to send messages to whoever is hearing your appeal? Probably can't. Can you afford to travel to wherever that appeal is being held? Probably not, because while you're traveling, who's going to be working on your field? How are you going to solve these practical matters? So I think, well, again, not too dissimilar to modern justice in some ways. If we think about justice today, so often you have to pay lawyers, and in any appeals procedure, these practical matters of funding and finance and whether you can do that or not take center stage. And I think it would have been the same back then. If you could pay, you could relitigate the case, and if you couldn't, then you couldn't. Also, to be fair, if you could pay, you also had the option of probably bribing your way out of the case, which might have been quicker.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's observe next connected subject. When did the separation of executive and judicial power occur?
Yeah, so that is it's a very tricky one. I would say that you get the emergence of the first lawyers, the sort of first legal officials in the Middle Kingdom, and that's a separation point of the executive from the judicial power. So in the Old Kingdom, as we were saying earlier, you've got these very high officials who are carrying out justice, administration, treasury matters, military matters, temple duties. You have it, whatever, local governorships as well. These are all under one figure. After the first intermediate, where you get that initial fragmentation of the state, this is where you've got local governments with slightly larger budgets that are able to train up local scribes. That is, I think, when you start getting the first trained legal officials who have not been trained by the pharaoh, who are independent of the pharaoh. They're not being appointed by him. They are emerging in these provincial areas. So we're not dealing with any kind of formal decision along the lines of, let's have executive power and judicial power and let's make them separate. This is very much an organic process. When you're starting to get local officials trained in law without pharaoh being directly involved, they are going to end up being judicially distinct. And later on, certainly by the Middle Kingdom, when you get things like pharaoh cannot execute people without due process, and when that's mentioned in Papyrus Westcar, that's an indication of law existing kind of independently of pharaoh. And that's a key point. So I think by the Middle Kingdom, that certainly exists. In the Old Kingdom, probably not. So if I had to put a date on this, I'd say about 2000 BC.
But what about the judicial system in governance? For example, if I am right, the official who ruled over some people can't to judge them.
So an official who is ruling over a certain population, is he going to judge that population, members of that population?
Yes.
So yeah, in the Old Kingdom, yes. I think the answer is absolutely clear, yes. You rule these people, you judge these people. There's probably always an element of that carrying on. I mean, I don't think you ever had full separation of judicial and executive power. And again, in the tale of the eloquent peasant in the Middle Kingdom, when you're talking about the processes of appeal, you are appealing to people who are, high officials in your own district. These are not sort of fully independent adjudicators. What I think you do start getting, though, in the Middle Kingdom is these specialized legal officials who can carry out justice, probably not very high order justice, uh, locally, instead of it going to the local governor or to whoever was notionally head of the setup. Uh, you know, you've had your donkey stolen. Is this a matter for the overseer of the district to look into? Or is this something which a local sejemu, a local justice official, is that a matter that one of those people can deal with instead? And it's probably that. So you're in this situation where kind of fairly minor cases are independent of the executive. They can be dealt with locally, but the larger cases, I think, are still going to be going to local power. They won't be going to Pharaoh. You haven't got the case as you did in the Old Kingdom, where everything that was going to law, everything that was being judged, was going to have to be taken to the centralized court. So that's the big difference. In the Old Kingdom, if you want access to any kind of formal law, you're gonna have to go to Memphis. Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, you can get that done locally, but whether you get that done before your local governor, or whether you can get that done before a sort of semi-independent uh, adjudicator in your local village, well, that's going to depend on the severity of your case and also probably on your willingness to travel.
In conclusion, what can we now say about the judicial and administrative system of ancient Egypt? Were it more developed than we previously assumed?
So this is the subject of the book which I'm currently working on, and hopefully within the next year or so, let's hope it comes out and we can talk more. But yes, the short answer is that this is a political system, a judicial system, which is much more regulated and contains within it many more checks and balances than has been previously assumed. And there are a number of reasons for this. And these reasons are not so much to do with the fact that Egypt does not have the evidence, but it's more to do with the fact that our own historical disciplines developed in a very particular kind of way. So most scholars working on constitutional thought, on the rule of law, on the separation of powers, and on related matters are very influenced by scholarship on democracy. Democracy, of course, from demos, Greek word, people power. This is a Greek concept. It's a Greek concept that has come through to us in a very heavily modified way. Therefore, if you look at the discourse on constitutional studies, on governance studies, people will still usually say the first elements of public accountability, the first elements of the rule of law come from Greece, because that's where democracy is enacted. They do that because our own system comes from that in some ways. The Greek philosophy, Greek writing, we write in an alphabet as well, unlike the Egyptians. all of these things. If you actually look at the evidence, though, this does not hold scrutiny at all. Because in ancient Greece, okay, you have elections, and in ancient Egypt you don't, not in the same way. But in Greece, these elections are held only in a very small number of cities. Athens has elections, Sparta doesn't, for example. So this is by no means universal for Greece. Secondly, the elections only feature men. Thirdly, they only feature free men, and fourthly, these are free men who have property, who earn above a certain amount of money. So the electorate in ancient Greece is actually completely tiny. In ancient Egypt, you don't have an electorate, but, for instance, you have equality before the law. So men and women are equal before the law. In Egypt, women can own property, women can testify in court, women can hold administrative office. In Greece, women can't do any of these things. Moreover, in Egypt, there is no legal mechanism for slavery. So, yes, there are going to be rich people and poor people, and some people will be more important than others, but you cannot own another person as a slave. You just haven't got the tools to do that. The legal system does not permit it. In Greece, you can. So, evidentially, I think there is a big problem with our current discourse, and that needs a big rethink. On top of that, it's also, I think, important to think about colonialism here and how that has played a role. So for centuries, obviously, the African continent of which Egypt is a part has been the colonized continent, whereas the European continent of which Greece is a part was the colonizing continent. Therefore, in terms of academic discourse, it was much more expedient to say that, if you like, civilized forms of government and civilized forms of law are associated with Europe, not associated with Africa. Because if it turns out that it's Africa that's actually come up with the civilized notions of law and government first, then how do you justify colonizing them? How do you justify things like slavery in Africa as well? All of that. So that's the second factor. So we've got kind of Greek-centric thinking. We've got colonialism, and the third factor is Christianity. So much of scholarship, again, European scholarship in particular, has been written by Christian thinkers and also funded by the Christian Church or various Christian churches. If you look at the Holy Scripture, if you look at the Bible, Egypt is not exactly seen in a good light in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Of course, it's
Of course, yes.
obvious reasons, and you do not want to portray the Egyptians as having this kind of superior political system when they are the bad guys. So you put the political system, you ascribe it to a sort of safer territory like the Greeks. So I guess this is the point I'm making. To conclude, is that the Egyptian evidence is incredibly diverse.
I'm sorry, but I think that the reason is that we did not have sources like you have for now.
Yeah, partly, and of course, in my analysis, I'm going to be presenting these sources, and we will be talking about them. But Jean-François Champollion, who deciphered hieroglyphs, did this in 1822. So I agree. This is not ancient Greece, for which we've always had the sources and for which we've been able to read the texts for many hundreds of years. In Egypt, we've only been doing this for 200 years. But the impression I still get is that the fundamental problem is not the kind of lack of scholarly tools. And this is actually a conclusion I've come to fairly recently while doing this research. Most of these key texts, they're actually either already well translated, or we've certainly had the capability of translating them for many decades. I mean, things like the Nauri decree of Seti I, let's say, well, that was first published in the 1920s. The tomb robbery papyri that, again, we've been talking about today, this is published in the 1930s. A lot of this is not really that new. What seems to be happening is this material is coming out and it's being read, it's being assessed by Egyptologists, and people are saying, oh, yes, this is very interesting. And this stays within Egyptology, but it doesn't break out into the public discourse. So this, I think, is Egyptologists' fault. It's because we don't do a very good job in outreach and in speaking to other fields. So, for example, most people outside of Egyptology are shocked when I say to them that in Egypt, women had equality before the law, or that in Egypt they didn't have pyramids, they didn't have slaves building the pyramids. Obviously, they had pyramids; they didn't have slaves building them.
Of course.
It,
We know
it's
for now.
yeah, yeah, and this is a problem of outreach. So yeah, of course, I don't disagree with your point. If you've been reading texts, Egyptian texts for 200 years, compared to Greek texts which were never lost, you're always going to be playing catch up, and that's just part of the game. But there's so much of this other stuff, which I think involves challenging very just very sort of long-held narratives about constitutional development, about political development, about complex society, and where these things come from, and that also is reflected in even in things like the funding landscape. So, Egyptology studies 3,000 years of political and legal development. Classics studies maybe 1,000 years of political development at most.
Of course.
Much shorter period. But classics even now has, gets a lot more funding. It gets a lot more people working on it. So we very often just don't have the people or the resources to tell that story in full. And that's actually, I think, one of the reasons why what you're doing is so great, because we're telling some of that story to a new audience. So I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much. Am I right that you think that the switching of mind and switching of way of thinking is more important than sources in this case?
Yes. So of course the sources are important. If you haven't got the sources, you can't do anything. But the point I'm making is that the sources really are not that new. In my research, I can't say I have really discovered that many radically new sources. I've analyzed a very large number of existing sources. I've retranslated many sources that were previously looked at in the 19th century and that were not always translated correctly. Of course, I've done that. I've come up with a new theory on when legal professionals first specialized in Egypt. I've carried that out. But the conclusion I have come to is that even with all of that, we should have much earlier recognized the profound constitutional significance and the legal significance of ancient Egypt as a system. The reason we haven't done that isn't because the sources weren't discovered, but because the sources were just not being used in that way. and because Egyptology has not done at all a good job of talking to other disciplines, of talking to the history of law, also of talking to classics. I want to be really clear here. I am not an enemy of the classicists. I'm not saying that the classicists have kind of stolen what was
That
rightfully
would be strange, I
Egypt's.
think.
No, I would certainly never do that. But what I am saying is we need to talk to these people. We need to have a conversation. It would be good for them as well. Greeks were going to Egypt for hundreds of years. They were bringing things to Egypt. The Egyptians were bringing things to Greece. Let's have a conversation about how that meaningfully developed.